Chris Amon was one of a triumvirate of New Zealanders who burst onto the Grand Prix scene in the 1960s. And whilst Denny Hulme and Bruce McLaren went on to find fame, win races and even world championships, Amon is almost unknown outside of racing circles, even in New Zealand. He never won a race, much less a title, despite being called one of the most skillful and natural drivers ever to grace Formula One by none less than Jackie Stewart. Amon is remembered, if he is remembered at all, as being the unluckiest driver the sport has known. Born into a farming family in Bulls on New Zealand's North Island in 1943, he learnt to drive at the age of 6 and found pleasure in hooning tractors around the family farm. At the age of 13, he was given an Australian magazine containing a report of the French Grand Prix of 1956, and his love of motorsport was sparked. As he grew older, he learnt to fly, gaining his solo licence at 16, and acquired his first car, a VW Beetle, which was a present from his father. The combination of the Beetle's natural tendency to oversteer everywhere and the loose gravel roads around the family farm did much to hone the young Amon's car control skills. An Austin A40 was acquired, and Amon began racing, although the age of the car, plus its state of disrepair, meant that it spent more time broken down than actually racing. Amon replaced it with a 1.5 litre Cooper single-seater, but the gearbox failed the first time out, and it was only repaired in time for the final race of the season. The Cooper was then replaced with a Maserati 250F, which just happened to be sitting in a car yard in New Zealand. It had something of a history, having been piloted by greats like Peter Collins, Mike Hawthorne and Jack Brabham. The latter was responsible for bringing it to New Zealand. It took 17-year-old Amon just 2 races to get the hang of the ageing Grand Prix car, and then in the face of competition from the likes of Sterling Moss, John Surtees and Roy Salvadori, who had come from Europe to race in the Tasman Series, he put up a good show in the front-engine Maserati against the more modern rear-engine Coopers. More importantly, his car control and driving style caught the attention of Reg Parnell, who was managing the Cooper team at the time. On returning to England, Parnell began to work on a deal to bring the young Amon to Europe, and after reaching an agreement with Shell, sent word to Amon to head to the UK. Within a day of arriving in London, Amon would pilot a Lola T4 in the Glover Trophy for Formula One cars, bringing it home in a creditable 5th place. From there, he travelled to Monaco for what should have been his Grand Prix debut, but after making it through qualifying in the ageing Lola, he was forced to miss the race after Maurice Trintignant suffered problems with his car and took over Amon's. His debut would be at Spa for the Belgian Grand Prix instead, where he would qualify 15th but be forced to retire with an oil leak after just 10 laps. He was the second youngest driver to start a Grand Prix at the time, and even now remains 11th on that list. He scored his first finishes in 7th place at both the French and British Grand Prix, and at the Italian Grand Prix, Amon had a lucky escape after a high-speed accident at the second Lesmo corner, crashing into trees and breaking several ribs. He developed DVT whilst in hospital, and so missed the US Grand Prix, but returned in Mexico, where gearbox failure ended his race after just 9 laps. Amon returned to New Zealand for the Southern Hemisphere summer, and to race in the Tasman Series in the Lola, but whilst he was away, Parnell, who had been his supporter and manager, died suddenly. Reg's son Tim was thrown into the role of team manager, whilst Kiwi Speedway rider Bruce Abethny took over the role of Amon's manager. For 1964, Tim Parnell secured a Lotus 25 for Amon to drive, although it would be powered by a weak BRM V8 engine. Nevertheless, Amon drove it to his first Grand Prix points finish in Holland, the high point in a season blighted with reliability and performance issues. Already a pattern was starting to form. 1965 would bring just 2 race starts, and 1966 one more. And whilst Amon worked as a test driver for Firestone and also on the John Frankenheimer Grand Prix movie, it seemed like his Formula One career had run off the rails. Then, early in 1967, and somewhat out of the blue, Amon got a call to meet with Enzo Ferrari, visited Maranello and signed a contract to race the red cars. He was one of 4 drivers contracted to race for Ferrari that year, alongside Lorenzo Bandini, Ludovico Scarfiotti and Mike Parks. Parks would only race twice, whilst Bandini was killed in a fiery crash at Monaco in the second race of the season. As a result, Amon became the de facto Ferrari team leader. It was at that Monaco race that Amon would score his first podium finish in Formula 1, clinching 3rd place, which would have been second but for a puncture 9 laps from the flag. The race was won by Denny Hulme, with Bruce McLaren finishing 4th, completing a remarkable result for New Zealand. It was the first of 4 podiums that season, but every time Amon was in a position to challenge for a win, the car failed. At Watkins Glen, whilst challenging Jim Clark for victory, the car lost oil pressure. Then in the following race in Mexico, fighting the same battle with Clark, his Ferrari ran out of fuel less than 3 laps from the flag. 1968 was to bring his best ever Formula 1 result, claiming 2nd place at the British Grand Prix. But in a season where Amon and the Ferrari had the pace to win the World Championship, the pairing only got to the finish line 3 times all season. In Spain, holding a big lead over Graham Hill, the Ferrari's fuel pump failed. At Spa, having qualified 4 seconds faster than anyone else and leading comfortably, a stone punctured the Ferrari's oil radiator, and at Monza an oil pipe failed, dumping fluid all over the Ferrari's rear tyre on the approach to the first Lesmo corner. Amon had another huge accident, with the car spinning off the track at full speed, hitting a poorly secured barrier which launched the car into the air, hitting an advertising hoarding 40 feet off the ground, before somersaulting through the treetops several times and landing in a spectator area the right way up. This was the first race where Amon had been using seatbelts, and there was no question that the accident would have been fatal without them. As one of the loudest critics of the drivers fighting for more safety in the sport, this must have been food for thought for the young Kiwi. As it was, he walked away from the accident with little more than a good shaking up. One race later in Canada, Amon had built up a lead of more than a minute, but with less than 20 laps at the finish, the Ferrari's gearbox failed. Amon and the Ferrari had been perhaps the quickest combination in Formula 1 for 2 years, but rather than collecting world championships, Amon just collected sympathy and a reputation for being unlucky. There's a common saying that you make your own luck, but the incredible number of failures which dogged Amon through his first 2 years at Ferrari went beyond anything within a driver's control. Had the Ferrari demonstrated any sort of reliability in 1968, Amon would not only have won races, he would almost certainly have beaten Graham Hill to the World Championship too. 1969 was to bring more of the same, even though Amon was surely due a break in his black streak. In Spain, after the 2 Lotuses had retired with failures of their high wings, Amon was left with a 40-second lead over Stewart when his engine failed comprehensively. And in Monaco, whilst lying in 2nd place ahead of eventual winner Graham Hill, the differential of the Ferrari gave up the ghost. A 3rd place at the Dutch Grand Prix brought his first points of the season, but then further mechanical failures in France persuaded him that Ferrari was never going to be able to match the speed and reliability of the Cosworth-powered cars, and he left the team halfway through the season. It was a massive decision for the young Kiwi, taking a step back from the most storied team in Formula 1 history and looking to break his streak of bad luck with a different team. It was clear that, along with Jackie Stewart and Jochen Rindt, Amon was one of the fastest drivers in Formula 1 at the time, and his frustration at the lack of results forced his hand. Indeed, it was Stewart and Rindt who persuaded Amon that he needed a Cosworth DFV engine if he was to have any chance of success. Even though Ferrari was unable to resolve its reliability issues for a further 2 seasons after Amon's departure, he admitted that the decision had been one he revisited over the next few years, expressing regret at what he called a knee-jerk reaction to the reliability problems which cost him so many victories. Enzo Ferrari was far from happy when Amon walked out. Ferrari fired drivers. They did not walk away from Ferrari. He was brutal in his assessment of Amon when looking back on the Kiwi's time at the team. He claimed that Amon lacked human warmth and didn't have the strength to last races, and was a better test driver than a racer. Given the number of times the car had failed him in winning positions over the course of the relationship, this was an extremely one-sided, somewhat typical of Ferrari, and his view that drivers were responsible when his cars lost, but beneficiaries of his team's engineering brilliance when they won. Part of the reason for Amon's decision to leave Ferrari was an agreement he had reached with Max Mosley and Robin Herd to drive for the new March team in 1970. Mosley and Herd had told Amon that he would be in a one-car team powered by a Cosworth DFV engine and that sponsorship was already in place. Amon turned down a contract with the French Matra team, believing the Cosworth engine to be a better prospect than Matra's new V12. When 1970 arrived, far from being the only driver in the March 701, Amon found the team to change on an almost daily basis. First, Siffert and Peterson were added, then Andretti had some outings for the team, and, perhaps worst of all, March was also providing the cars for Tyrrell's team of Stewart and Sever. Politics and organisational issues were to affect the March team throughout the season. Having similar equipment to Stewart, though, allowed Amon to underline his talent. The two recorded identical times in qualifying for the first race in South Africa and started side by side on the front row of the grid, but Amon was knocked off the road at the first corner by a fast-starting Jochen Rindt and retired with cooling system failure, likely a result of the contact. In the non-championship International Trophy at Silverstone in April, Amon clinched his first win in a Formula One car, beating Jackie Stewart, but a Grand Prix victory still eluded him. In Spain, the car needed 3 pit stops to try and cure a misfire, but the engine finally failed. In Monaco, Amon lost second place after having to pit with another misfire, and then dropped out of the race altogether when his suspension failed. Before the next race in Belgium, Amon had to deal with the death of his friend and fellow Kiwi Bruce McLaren, who was killed whilst testing his Can-Am car at Goodwood. Amon and McLaren had just returned from a month in the United States together for the Indy 500, where Amon had been driving one of McLaren's cars. The Belgian Grand Prix brought another front row start for Amon, qualifying alongside Stewart and Rindt, and was finally on the way to that elusive victory when the BRM of Pedro Rodriguez, coming out of nowhere, blew past the March as if it was standing still. The straight-line performance differential was so great, and so much more than BRM had been able to achieve to that point in the season, that Amon was convinced the team was cheating and that the engine in the car was actually a 3.3 litre version of the company's V12. Amon gave everything trying to repass the Flying Mexican, including setting a new lap record which was faster than Stewart's pole position lap, but it was all in vain, and he finished the race in second place, a second behind Rodriguez. He scored another second place in France behind Rindt, but mechanical failures ended his races in Holland and Germany, whilst in Austria a shock absorber leaked all of its fluid and sent him tumbling down the order with the resulting handling problems. He also had to watch Jackie Ickx take his first win for Ferrari in the car Amon had abandoned for the March. At Monza, the death of Jochen Rindt overshadowed the actual racing. Rindt had told him that he was planning to retire at the end of the season if he won the title. Aside from having to deal with the death of another friend, Amon was now having issues with the March team. They had missed payments due to him as part of his $100,000 retainer for the season. At Monza, he was given an engine which was seriously detuned and struggled to even make it onto the grid, the suggestion being that the team were trying to prevent him qualifying to help them renege on the payments due. The team was on the edge of bankruptcy, and when Matra once more approached Amon with an offer for 1971, he jumped at the chance to leave March behind. 1971 started well for Amon and Matra, winning the non-championship Argentinian Grand Prix, albeit against a weakened field which was missing Ferrari and was bolstered with several Formula 5000 cars. But the season itself was to have strong echoes of the past. Amon qualifying strongly for early races, only to be let down by mechanical failure, whilst he himself took the blame for running off the road in the Dutch Grand Prix whilst trying to pass Stewart for the lead. By mid-season, it was clear that the new Matra V12 was struggling for performance and reliability, and Amon and teammate Beltoise slipped down the grid. The team skipped the Austrian Grand Prix in a bid to get to the bottom of the problems, and discovered that the engine was suffering from an oil churning issue, which had been costing them upwards of 50 brake horsepower, a not insignificant amount when the overall output from the engine was only around 450 brake horsepower. At the next race at Monza, Amon put the Matra on pole comfortably, demonstrating how the engine problem had been hampering performance. In a typically tight Monza slipstreaming race, Amon had hit the front and had the race under control with 5 laps to go when the visor on his helmet came off, leaving him trying to drive with a 200 miles an hour wind blowing straight into his eyes. Unsurprisingly, he slipped back through the field and out of contention. 1972 went no better, A succession of gearbox problems blighted the early part of the season, and the team was having engines fail on a regular basis too. For the French Grand Prix at the wonderful Clermont-Ferrand circuit, Matra replaced its engine with a theoretically less powerful one from its sports car program, and Amon put the car on pole position. The engine may have been less powerful in theory, but the Formula 1 engine suffered from poor piston ring design, which meant that it lost power in actual use. From pole, Amon set off at a rate of knots, leaving Denny Hulme and Jackie Stewart trailing in his wake. Then, just after half distance, Amon suffered a punctured left front tyre, and a slow lap back to the pits plus a stop of nearly 90 seconds to change it meant that he rejoined the field in 9th place and a long way behind the leaders. Now, Clermont-Ferrand was something like a modern-day Hungaroring, with limited overtaking opportunities, but the red mist was on Amon, and he set off after the field like a demon. He set new lap records, diving past one car after another, and by the end of the race had climbed back to 3rd place. He finished 32 seconds behind Stewart and less than 4 seconds behind Fittipaldi, and was running close to 4 seconds a lap faster than either. Of all the races which had been denied him by bad luck, this was the one which hit hardest. In a French car, at the French Grand Prix, having qualified 0.8 of a second faster than anyone else, and having been a league ahead in the race, the puncture destroyed Amon's confidence. He later admitted that the French Grand Prix was the turning point for him, that from then on he always believed something was going to happen to prevent him clinching that Grand Prix victory. Matra's engine problems reappeared after the French Grand Prix, and towards the end of the season, with the car failing so regularly, Amon and Matra owner Jean-Luc Lagardère had a frank discussion, which resulted in the Frenchman deciding to end his company's involvement in Formula 1. With Matra gone, Amon started negotiating with March for 1973, initially agreeing to drive the first races of the season for free, but asking for a share of sponsorship money thereafter. Amon returned to New Zealand for Christmas, expecting to sign a contract with the team on his return to Europe. However, an article written by BRM owner Lewis Stanley, which praised Amon and suggested he could win the World Championship in a BRM, spooked Max Mosley, and before he had even signed a contract, Amon found himself sacked by the team. Instead, he found himself at the new Italian Tecno team, running with sponsorship from drinks company Martini and Rossi. The start of the relationship suggested things were going to be complicated. Martini and Tecno had commissioned 2 different cars, which were to be built in England and Italy respectively. The team would run both and decide which to use for the season. The second complication was that the team was building its own flat 12 engine. Given the problems Amon had experienced with reliability at both Ferrari and Matra, this seemed a poor fit of driver and team. Ominously, the first tests of the car were curtailed with engine problems, and an inability to resolve these meant the team skipped the first race of the season. Before the second race in Belgium, Enzo Ferrari reached out to Amon about potentially driving a third car for Ferrari. The team's confidence in the ability of Jackie Ickx and Arturo Merzario was at an all-time low. Tecno refused to release him for the race, figuring that a good showing in the Ferrari would likely mean they never got their driver back. The Tecno made its debut in Belgium, and despite continued engine problems, Amon qualified the car 15th and climbed to 6th place in the race, bringing the team a World Championship point in its first race. What sounds like a relatively straightforward race was anything but. The new engine was desperately thirsty, so the car needed to carry far more fuel than other cars on the grid, making it heavy and blunting performance. Furthermore, the car's radiator pipes passed through the cockpit, dumping an incredible amount of heat on their way. Amon finished the race with burns on his feet and back as a result. More engine problems, added to issues with brakes, plagued the car at Monaco. And following that race, Amon, Tecno owner Pedersani and manager David York met to discuss a way forward. The meeting became quite heated, with Amon demanding the team skip the Swedish Grand Prix in order to get the second car finished and tested, which Pedersani claimed to be an affront. Amon also warned that the engine was so down on power that the car would be woefully outpaced at performance circuits like Paul Ricard and Silverstone. The team eventually skipped the Swedish race, but the second car wasn't ready for testing anyway. Then a dispute between Tecno and Martini over money meant the car never showed up for the French Grand Prix at all, and when it arrived in England for the British Grand Prix, Amon's prediction of its performance problems was proved true. The car was 4 seconds off the pace and the slowest in the race. The second car was tested at Silverstone after the Grand Prix, and Amon found it to have an excellent chassis. However, the problem was not the chassis, but rather the terrible performance of the engine. In Holland, the Tecno was 15 miles an hour slower on the start-finish straight than the rest of the field, and engine problems once more ended the race early. Amon refused to drive the car at the Nürburgring because he didn't believe he would survive the experience. In qualifying in Austria, the Tecno was 6 seconds off the pace, and Amon withdrew from the race. Then, for the team's home Grand Prix in Italy, the car was so bad in pre-race testing that Amon told Pedezzani that he would never drive it again. Now unemployed, Amon received a call from Ken Tyrrell to drive a third car in the final races of the 1973 season in Canada and the United States. In a wet race in Canada, he suffered a fuel pressure problem which caused him a lengthy stop, whilst at Watkins Glen the whole team withdrew after Severe's fatal accident. Fed up with putting his destiny in the hands of others, Amon decided the answer was to start his own team and build his own car. Despite claiming that it would be straightforward and simple, using the Cosworth DFV for power, what was actually produced by the team was complex and quite advanced, and far too difficult for a new team to sort. On its first test at Goodwood, a front suspension failure caused Amon to crash heavily. After facing further problems with its suspension, the car missed its scheduled debut, and eventually raced for the first time in Spain. In heavily revised form, it proved to be slow, and eventually retired following a brake failure after just 23 laps. At Monaco, the team withdrew from the race after problems with its front wheel hubs. After failing to qualify in Italy, the Amon project was packed away for good, and Chris was offered the chance to drive for the struggling BRM team for the final 2 races of the season. And whilst things in Canada were almost as desperate as they had been in his own car, Amon took the BRM to a 9th place finish after qualifying 11th on the grid at Watkins Glen. And that seemed to be the end of the road, until Mo Nunn offered him a couple of drives in the Ensign team at the tail end of the 1975 season. The car wasn't great, but Amon impressed the team by making subtle changes to the setup of the car's airbox, which greatly improved performance. The team offered him a seat for 1976, and Amon jumped at the chance, feeling the underfunded Ensign team was actually better organised than some of the other teams he had been driving for. This was to prove to be a painful season for Amon. In Belgium, whilst battling Patrick Depailler and James Hunt, a wheel came off the car and it crashed heavily, finishing upside down against a bank, with the driver scrambling to get out to avoid a similar fate to Roger Williamson. 2 races later in Sweden, the front suspension on the car failed, causing another huge accident, cutting through catch fencing and smashing into the barrier at the end of the straight. Amon escaped both accidents with nothing worse than bruising. Then came the Nürburgring and Niki Lauda's awful crash. Amon arrived on the scene after Lauda had already been pulled from his car, but he noted the length of time it took for medical help to arrive. The harsh reality of driving a car which was regularly braking in catastrophic ways on a circuit where almost every accident was going to be monumental, added to the knowledge that medical assistance didn't arrive for Lauda until 5 minutes after he himself had stopped at the crash site, was a powerful enough argument for Amon to decide not to take the restart. After Germany, he terminated his contract with Ensign, and then entered and withdrew from one race for Wolf in Canada, before walking away from Formula One for good. He returned to New Zealand and farming, later becoming a motoring correspondent, and eventually dying of cancer at the age of 73. For a driver so highly rated, who lost so many races from winning positions, and who seemed to have mechanical issues on every race car he drove, from his first Austin A40 through to the last Ensign, it seems that Chris had no luck at all. Mario Andretti once said of Amon that if he became an undertaker, people would stop dying. And it really seemed like he was cursed. Yet Amon never saw it that way. His view was that he drove in nearly 100 Grand Prix across 14 seasons and had several large accidents without ever being badly injured, at a time when drivers were dying with appalling frequency and in the most terrible ways. Survival was in itself a victory. There's no question that Amon was fast enough to win races and championships, and perhaps if he had persevered at Ferrari, things would have ended differently. As it is, he will always be remembered as the Kiwi who flew, but never quite touched the sun.